recorded. I think you'll be needed to say, yeah, you accept it. And with that, I'm going to turn this over to Alan Journet. Many of you know Alan as the founder and co-facilitator for SOCAN, our Coastal SOCAN parent group. And Alan has been doing this for almost a decade, and this being Coastal SOCAN. And so Alan is starting to share his screen. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Alan.
Well, thanks very much indeed. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. We were talking about coming over to the coast, but Kathy and I have a bunch of other things going on. So we decided to Zoom it in, probably more healthy for all of us anyway. And I'm going to start with a photograph, and I'm going to show a few images as we're going through just to soothe the savage beast. And I'm hoping that most of you will recognize from where I took this photograph, the parking lot up at Harris Beach. And Kathy and I took a trip over to the coast about 3 weeks ago and had a lovely dinner with Bill and several folks here at the Catalyst. And I'm going to show you some photographs from that trip, just as I said, to make life a little more attractive. So let's start the ball rolling. And Bill asked me to talk about climate action in Oregon. And I thought, well, Oregon's not the only place where there's a bit of climate action going on. There is some stuff happening federally. So I should probably throw in a few words about federal as well, which I'm going to do towards the beginning of the talk. And that's who I am. And at the bottom, you will see my phone number and my email address, alan@socan.eco. We are socan.eco, not socan.org, which is a mistake lots of people make. But we're one of the few organizations that has the .eco suffix. So let's start the ball rolling by a few notes on what I'm going to do this evening. I'm going to start with just a few words from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change 2021 report, Code Red for Humanity. Then we'll talk about what's happening federally. I'll talk about some legislation and the Biden administration's bipartisan infrastructure package and the reconciliation package. Then we'll do a break, and I'll come back and talk about what's happening in Oregon, the legislative session, which ended on June the 28th, I think it was, and the governor's executive order, and just a few words at the end on what we can do, or I'll try and answer the question, what can we do? So let's start from Humbug Mountain. What Kathy and I did was climb up Humbug Mountain, and for the young Turks out there, I just want to convince you that, yes, indeed, the old farts did make it to the top of Humbug, and this is a photograph from the peak, the summit of Humbug Mountain. So let's talk a little about the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. I'm going to, every once in a while, adjust where everybody is on my screen. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres introduced the UN IPCC Working Group 1 report with the comment that today's IPCC Working Group 1 report is a code red for humanity. The alarm bells are deafening and the evidence is irrefutable. Greenhouse gas emissions from fossil fuel burning and deforestation are choking our planet and putting billions of people at immediate risk. Global heating is affecting every region on Earth, with many of the changes becoming irreversible. From that particular report, I quote, "It is unequivocal that human influence has warmed the atmosphere, ocean, and land. Widespread and rapid changes in the atmosphere, ocean, cryosphere, and biosphere have occurred." And one of the authors of the IPCC, Ed Hawkins from the University of Reading, particularly said, "It is a statement of fact. We cannot be any more certain. It is unequivocal and it is indisputable that humans are warming the planet. And every government agreed to that. And parenthetically, that wording in the summary for policymakers. It's impossible for us to suggest, I think, any longer, well, it's just a hypothesis. From a scientific perspective, we've reached the point where this is about as certain as we can get. Anybody who has been on one of my presentations in the past will know that I have a tendency to show a number of graphs, and I'm not going to have so many graphs today, but I wanted to show you a couple that come right from the summary for policymakers of the IPCC report. This one, as you can see, takes us over the last 2,000 years, looking at global temperature. And one of the interesting things you can see, if you can see my pointer, that the temperature fluctuates, it varies year to year, not surprisingly. But then from about 1,200 years ago up until relatively recently, you can see the temperature was declining. And yes, indeed, it was. And the reason for that was largely because the Milankovitch cycle, which is a combination of 3 cycles, and I don't have time to go into those this evening, but the Milankovitch cycle was actually putting us on a trend in towards another ice age. So the temperature was going down, and then suddenly James Watt discovered the steam engine and coal, and then we started pumping greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, and that's what you can see in this little section of the chart right over here on the right, which will blow up right here. So this is starting in 1850 and coming up to 220. And I'll walk you through this graph because it's rather interesting. What we can see is the black line represents the actual observed temperatures over that period of time. And then the brownish line represents the average of a series of simulations that were run backwards through time and using all of the data that they use in simulations, but it included both natural and human emissions of greenhouse gases. And what you can see from that graph is that those models, when we run them backwards, actually produce a trend which is very, very similar to what we actually saw. Now, one of the things that folks say, and if you were lucky enough to read a column by George Will, which was initially, I think, in the New York Times, what you will have heard is, oh, it's too difficult to tease out human impact from natural factors. And I could probably respond to that with the expanded version of what BS really means. Mm-hmm. Climate scientists have been separating the natural factors and their influence on climate from human-induced influences. And so what we can do here is see on the green area, this is a simulation of what the temperature trend would have been had there only been natural influences on the temperature. And these primarily are comprised of solar radiation and volcanic activity. I think that does not include the Milankovitch cycle, but I'm not 100% sure. What we can see is if we do not include human behavior, the emissions of greenhouse gases as a result of our activities, the models show us the temperature actually should not be rising. Yes, indeed, climate scientists have teased this out and can show us what would be happening if there were no greenhouse gases. And we have to thank James Watt and his wonderful invention of the steam engine for the warming that we have seen. Just as an interesting side note, every once in a while, somebody will ask me, so exactly what proportion of global warming is caused by human activity? First time I was asked that question, and it actually gave me a pause. And I thought about it for a bit, and I said, well, actually, interestingly, the answer is over 100%. because as you can see back here, absent human emissions, the temperature was cooling. And that trend in the Milankovitch cycle has continued. So what should be happening is the temperature should be cooling. So what we have managed to do in our tremendous innovative lifestyle is not only negate the cooling that's been happening, but we have added to it warming. Hence, more than 100% of the warming is due to us. Another a couple of charts from that same IPCC report. This one indicates the observed warming that's happened since 1850 to 1900. And you can see it's the 2010-2019 average relative to 1850-1900. And what you can see is it's a little over a degree centigrade, about 1.1 degrees centigrade, something like that, which if you multiply by 8 and divide by 5 will give you the equivalent in Fahrenheit. Over here, we can see the aggregated contributions of human activity. So the first little orangey red line you will notice is exactly the same as the gray one in the previous chart, because that's the summation of human influence. But what you can see immediately to the right of that is the overall impact of all the things we are doing that are causing warming. And you can see our total positive impact is about 1.5 degrees centigrade. But there are things that we have done which are actually causing cooling. And hence there is a little blue bar going downwards. And that represents the things we have been doing that have been causing cooling. Now, I don't have time to go into the details of what each of those two bars comprises, but if you pull up the IPCC report, you can see the right-hand chart is expanding, so you can actually see what all the components are that are causing the warming and causing the cooling. And here's a rather disturbing little factor that comes again from the summary for policymakers. What we realize, those of us who've been paying attention, and I'm going to take a wild ass guess that this includes most of you guys, what we know is from the 2018 IPCC report that what we really have to do is keep warming below 1.5 degrees centigrade above the pre-industrial condition. What they report in the IPCC is what our budget for greenhouse gas emissions would be if we want to limit warming to 1.5 degrees centigrade above the 1850 to 1900 average. But you got to add to that we went up about 0.2, I think is of a degree centigrade between 1750 and 1850, something like that, although that's not exactly a lock on what that number is. People tend to go back to the 1850-1900 time range just because we're more confident about what the values are for that period. And so folks often ask the question, so what exactly budget in greenhouse gas emissions do we have if we want to keep ourselves below 1.5 degrees centigrade above that historical value? And the latest IPCC report, the Working Group 1 report that just came out, gives us some numbers. They say, if we want a 50% chance of keeping ourselves below 1.5 degrees centigrade above, again, 1850, 1900, we have a budget of 500 gigatons of carbon dioxide. If we want a 67% chance, it's 400 gigatons. And if we want an 83% chance, it's only 300 gigatons. Now, so let's ask ourselves, how many years does that mean? Really great question. And so we look at the current rate of emissions, and I've given you two values. The first is the current rate of carbon dioxide equivalent emissions, which includes all of the greenhouse gases we're pumping out there. That's about 50 gigatons, 50 billion tons per annum. The current rate of just carbon dioxide is about 40, a little over 40. I think it was 43 in 2019. That's gigatons per annum. So if we do a little math, we can figure out how long we have to reach to having emitted all of the greenhouse gases we can afford to emit if we want to reach one of those targets. And here we go. We have to be net zero by 2030 if we're using the 50% chance, 2028 if we're using the 67% chance, and 2026 if we want to use the 83% chance. So that means, sports fans, we have 5 years to get to net zero. If we don't do it, net zero, I should clarify, means we are emitting as much greenhouse gases as natural processes absorb from the atmosphere. So if we don't do that, then we're going to go into an overshoot and we're going to go negative. And then after that, we don't only have to be net zero, but we have to be actually sucking greenhouse gases out of the atmosphere on top of having reduced our emissions to net zero. And that's why we are describing this as code red for humanity. So I'm going to show you, as I mentioned, a few slides from our trip down the coast from up at Hamburg. And so I'm going to show you the slides that I took in reverse order. So we're starting from Brookings and working north. And so this is a slide from probably everybody here recognizes it, Thunder Rock Cove. And I just showed you this one to give us a chance to cool down a little from the previous rather alarming information. So let's have a look at federal legislation. And I'm going to point out 2 or 3 things that are coming through, and then we'll talk about all of this infrastructure stuff that's coming down the pike. Senate Bill 938, the Climate Emergency Act of 2021, was introduced largely by Bernie Sanders, and it has been referred to the Environment and Public Works Committee. And what this bill does is essentially declare a climate emergency. And so this means that it's a national emergency to address climate. So it requires that the president declare a national emergency. And if you want to, you can look up all the things that declaring a national emergency allows presidents to do. What they want to do is collect money from the individuals that are, they want to invest money in expanding access to clean and affordable energy, modernizing and retrofitting infrastructure, investing in public health in preparation for extreme climatic events. Are we having those? I wonder. Protect and restore natural systems, support farmers and rural communities, particularly in the area of regenerative agriculture, which is the kind of agriculture that brings carbon back into the soil rather than conventional agriculture, which results in carbon volatilizing from the soil and passing up into the atmosphere, and transforming our entire industrial base to clean energy technology. They want to promote a just transition, reduce greenhouse gas emissions, promote resilience to climate change. There is a certain amount of climate change, as you will appreciate, we've already experienced, and we're going to experience more. Even if we stopped pumping greenhouse gases out in the atmosphere at the end of this meeting, we'd still get more warming. We need to they want to support small businesses, especially those owned by minorities and women, and expand public services. A second bill that I want to talk about actually at a little length is House Resolution 2307. Anybody who's been following the Citizens Climate Lobby will be aware of their proposal for a a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. They unfortunately call it a carbon tax. I don't know why, but they really are proposing to tax all greenhouse gas emissions. So they have the proposal that would tax emissions and then return all of that money to the taxpayers. House Resolution 2307 is essentially a bill that emulates what the Citizens Climate Lobby has been advocating, and they've been advocating that for a long time. Ted Deutsch, Democrat from Florida, is the current lead on this particular bill. It's been referred to Ways and Means, Energy and Commerce, and Foreign Affairs. So what does this do? Essentially, it imposes a fee of $15, adjusted for inflation and rising by $10 a year, on the greenhouse gas carbon dioxide equivalent emissions content of fossil fuels, including crude oil, natural gas, coal, or any other product derived from those fuels that can be used so as to emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. There are a number of elements of this that are worth mentioning. It targets extraction, processing, or the importer of fossil fuels. So it goes to the source of these fossil fuels as they enter the economy, the nation, or are extracted from the ground. It performs something that I have been promoting for years. It promotes a full life cycle emissions assessment. That's particularly important because a lot of times, and I might talk about this later, a lot of times people propose bills that only address the combustion emissions of fossil fuels. What that does is overlook the fugitive emissions or leakage, for example, of methane from fossil fuels. And that mistake is what has allowed the fossil gas or natural gas companies to claim that their product is the clean fossil fuel, because they ignore the tremendous leakage of methane from extraction through processing and transmission. So I particularly like this component of the of House Resolution 2307. It does exempt military emissions, agricultural, or non-emitting uses of fossil fuels. It's unfortunate, really, but I can see why military is omitted. I think there'd probably be a big national security scream if we started addressing the military, but we really should be doing that. It offers a rebate for those who capture or sequester carbon dioxide through, as I mentioned, agriculture, regenerative agriculture, or forestry that sucks carbon out of the atmosphere. There is a border adjustment that allows a refund to fuels that are exported, and also for fuels that are being imported that have had some kind of a greenhouse gas tax imposed on them in the country from which they come. A component, which I will discuss in a moment, is this proposal includes a component which says it will be decommissioned when emissions drop to 10% of their 2010 level. The Carbon Dividend Trust Fund then repays monthly as a rebate to citizens and lawful residents. All of the money, probably less administrative costs, refunds that back to citizens and lawful residents. So let's have a look at the trajectory that they include in the bill. And this is what they are saying they want to achieve. Starting in 2023, emissions reductions are going to be 5% of the 2010 level each year. And then from 2031 to 2050, 3% of that 2010 emissions per year. And so just to help you out, I constructed a graph to display what this would mean. Now, there is that little wrinkle, remember, it's decommissioned when emissions drop to 10% of the 2010 level. And so I put a little bar there to let you know when that is, approximately. So a really great question to ask of House Resolution 2307 is, how long before the trajectory actually arrives at net zero? Remember, we've just discussed how critical it is for us to reach net zero, even if we're satisfied with a 50% chance of a 1.5 degrees centigrade increase, that we have to be at net zero by 2030, 2028, 2030. And the answer is, this program never will reach net zero because it's decommissioned once it gets to 10%. That's a bit troubling in my judgment. Second concern I have, and this is a really profound one, is can a $15 per ton fee achieve the trajectory that is indicated here as the trajectory that they want, even if it's going up at $10 a year? Now, back in 2013, when I first started engaging in state action, a study was commissioned by the legislature from the Portland State University Northwest Economics Research Center to ask the question, how much of a fee would we need in order to achieve the trajectory of emissions that was established in House Bill 3543 from 2007, the target of which was 75% below 1990 emissions levels in Oregon by 2050. And the answer that they came up with was, in order to achieve that trajectory, remember only 70% below 1990 level, to achieve that trajectory, the fee would have to be $150. Less than that wouldn't get us even there. And so the other concern I have about House Resolution 2307 is they are not imposing a fee which is anywhere near enough to do even what they are claiming they want this proposal to do. So I would say it's a good idea probably, but it's not good enough. And I have to say, I constantly wonder whether it's recognition on the part of conservatives that this $15 fee is not going to do anything that allows them to support it. Okay, call me a cynic. I'm not sure about that, but it's just a little suspicion. Okay, another little break to allow you to enjoy some cooling. This is another item of legislation that I just came across. It's called the Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act. I think it's so new that it doesn't even have a number, but it's going to have a Senate number because these are all senators. And this is what this little rascal does. I just wanted to mention that Chris Van Hollen, Democrat from Maryland, might be known to you as he is the author of a bill that was introduced several times over recent sessions called the Healthy Climate and Family Security Act. That is an interesting proposal because it's a hybrid. Those of you who've been following climate action for any length of time probably have heard about the cap and dividend approach, the fee and dividend approach that the Citizens Climate Lobby proposes. And you have heard that there is also the program that California has, which is a cap and trade approach. Well, what Chris Van Hollen proposed a while back was this one, which is a hybrid. It's a cap and dividend. So it puts a cap on emissions. It would have put a cap on emissions and then returns the money to taxpayers. But what this Polluters Pay Climate Fund Act does is it charges $500 billion over a period of 10 years to US fossil fuel corporations, which, as we know, are the primary drivers of the problem. Sure, we use the fossil fuel that they produce, so we are certainly implicated. But those are the rascals who've been telling us for years, oh, climate change, nothing happening, not us, not us. So what this proposal does is make polluters pay. And this is what ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron would be charged, somewhere between $5 and $6 billion per annum, which it is pointed out is less than 3% of their annual revenue. Then the funds go to assist those who are affected by global warming. Now, let's talk about Infrastructure Week a little. We've all been hearing a lot about the excitement that comes down the pike with the bipartisan bill. I'm afraid I'm going to have to undermine the excitement a little. Michael Mann, who is one of the leading climate scientists in the nation, works at Penn State University, wrote an article, an op-ed in Time magazine, which evaluated the bipartisan infrastructure package. And this is what he wrote. The $15 billion in climate resilience funding that will protect people from the storms, droughts, floods, and other extreme weather events made by climate change. Thumbs up on that one. But there is $15 billion of support for a delusional proposal called the carbon capture and storage technology, which actually promotes coal. And I call it a delusional carbon capture and storage proposal because 30 years ago, proponents of this technology said, hey, we're working on it, we'll have it perfected in 30 years. And then now what they're saying is, we're working on it, we'll have it perfected in 30 years. And you that kind of argument, you might identify also with the proponents of nuclear fusion 30 years ago. Yeah, 30 years we'll have it done. And then now they're saying, yeah, we'll have it in 30 years. This bipartisan bill undermines environmental review processes comprising frontline, the review process that will compromise frontline communities who can no longer elicit environmental review of various proposals. It exempts oil and gas pipelines on federal land from environmental assessment. Why would they do that? On federal land, they can require that. It calls for logging 30 million acres of national forest with a $1.6 billion subsidy. Now, we know there are problems in our forests. We know that wildfires are happening, but logging isn't the solution, it's the problem. And this is the touted bipartisan bill. They only budgeted about a third of the $45 billion promised for lead pipe replacement. And anybody who's been aware of what's been happening in Flint over the last few years will know we've actually got to get the lead out. Now, one of the points that Michael Mann made in his column was that if you look at that little bipartisan gang of senators who worked on this bill, a third of them, and that includes Republicans and Democrats, are major recipients of ExxonMobil funding. So, big surprise, fossil fuels get subsidies. So, we ask ourselves, can the $3.5 trillion reconciliation package help us? Well, it might help us, certainly, probably more than this one. So that, I'm not going to go through all of the $3.5 trillion, but I just give you some hints on where some of the funds are allocated that could be helpful. The Committee on Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions is scheduled to get $726 billion. And this in part, this is not all for this component, but it in part would fund a civilian climate corps, which would be a corps of individuals undertaking projects that are helpful in relation to fighting climate change. The Committee on Energy and Natural Resources would get $198 billion, and that would support clean electricity payments, consumer rebates to weatherize and electrify homes, federal procurement of energy efficient materials, and climate research. Committee on Agriculture, Nutrition, and Forestry gets 135, some of which will go for agricultural conservation, drought, and forestry programs that help reduce carbon emissions and prevent wildfires. Well, okay, so long as it doesn't mean logging. Agricultural climate research and research infrastructure, and a bit of this also goes to that civilian climate corps. The Committee on Commerce, Science, and Technology gets 83 to support coastal resiliency, healthy ocean investments, including the National Oceans and Coastal Security Fund and Technology Directorate. And also funds would go to the National Science Foundation to support research and technology. The Committee on Environment and Public Works would get $67 billion, and that could go to Clean Energy Technology Accelerator, environmental justice investments, an EPA climate and research program, federal investments in energy efficient buildings and green materials, and investments in clean vehicles. The Committee on Homeland Security and Government Affairs gets $37 billion to electrify the federal vehicle fleet. Why, oh, why has this not already been done? Electrifying and rehabilitating federal buildings. Again, why has this not been done? And finally, the Committee on Indian Affairs would get about $20.5 billion, and this could support native energy programs, native resilience and climate programs, and a native civilian climate corps. Okay, and here we are at Thunder Rock Coast North, wondering if the tide is coming in or going out. Let's have a look at the importance of agencies. In the Trump era, there were several of the agencies, as you might know, were engaged in actions which were particularly negative. And what this does is illustrate the importance not just of legislations, but also of what the agencies are doing. The Trump EPA pursued an aggressive agenda seeking to suspend, revise, or rescind regulations that unduly burden the development of domestic energy resources. They also challenged the California clean fuel rules, which you probably are aware of, or maybe aware of. One of the things that's happened since the Biden administration came in is they have reversed that effort to challenge California's clean fuel rules. So who's manning the agencies is critical. The Trump Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, or FERC, imposed measures that increased the bid prices of renewable resources to counteract perceived subsidies resulting from those policies. Recently, the Democratic chair was appointed and expressed climate concern. The composition of FERC may well change during the course of the coming year, which would be really delightful. And I just learned this as I was getting ready for this evening's talk. FERC actually has the authority to impose a price on greenhouse gas emissions. Now, you can pretty much bet that if they tried to do that, all hell would break loose, but they have that authority. I'm not going to go through all the agencies, but the Supreme Court of the United States is a problem. as you are probably aware, they now have a very strong conservative majority. And so that may well reverse an incredibly important decision that came down in 2007, Massachusetts versus the EPA, because that Supreme Court decision confirmed that the Environmental Protection Authority has the authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions. Now, if SCOTUS reverses that, then the EPA will not have that authority. So who's on the Supreme Court is critical. Okay, so now we're going to take a break, and we're going to try and see if we've got any questions on the federal stuff on the IPCC.
So I had put a posted in the chat. If anybody has any questions, you can either alert me in the chat, or you can go down to reactions and raise your hand. And it's good to give Alan a chance to take a break.
Yeah, I can tell my voice is going.
Yeah.
I'll try and go through to the end.
Quick question for you. I had heard that some people are saying the current rebates for electric cars favor the people that are rich enough to afford Teslas. What's your sense on that, of how the current rebates are? And I don't know what they actually are, but what about upcoming ones? What's your sense?
Well, I think you raise an incredibly important question, and I can say that that's something that we're very, very conscious of as we are monitoring what's happening in Oregon, as I'll talk about in a few minutes. Because there is a real problem if all we do is provide rebates to people who buy electric vehicles. What we have to do is make electric vehicles more available to individuals who are not in the upper income category or upper income wealth category. And that's a very important point. And we've got to be very conscious of that. I don't know whether there's anything in the reconciliation package which would address that. But if funds end up coming into Oregon, we're going to be watching that to make sure somehow that question is addressed.
It's yet another interesting aspect of the interrelatedness of equity and climate change and all those. So they are interestingly intertwined. So.
Oh, absolutely. I think it's critical that we understand that addressing climate change must incorporate a tremendous consciousness that whatever we come up with does not exacerbate decades of social injustice, but rather addresses it, tries to solve it. And one of the areas that can work very effectively in this arena, you might remember one of the components that is receiving funds is weatherization. And if we can help low-income residents weatherize their houses, what they're going to do is reduce their energy consumption, because they don't need to spend so much energy heating and cooling. And so we're both addressing climate change and addressing social injustice issues, income inequity.
Good. I have one question. Peter, I'll just read it for Linda. Representative Peter DeFazio holding a town phone call tomorrow at 3. Any suggestions for a good targeted question for him to ask him during his town hall? What would you want to ask?
Would you think about it and pick it up at the end?
Yeah, maybe let me think about it. Maybe something will come to me as I'm going through the Oregon state stuff.
Yeah.
I think maybe to ask him how he feels about the huge subsidy coming out of the bipartisan infrastructure bill that would subsidize logging. And what can he do to reverse that?
Good suggestion. Well, why don't we use that as a good segue into Oregon legislation, and we'll
Okay.
keep going.
And before I start, I'm going to apologize because I'm going to be doing a Marco Rubio and drinking a glass of water as I go. Okay. Okay. Oregon 2021 legislation. Those of you who have been following what's been happening in the legislature over the last few years will know, and I'll come back to this point in a few minutes, that we have been trying to get comprehensive greenhouse gas emissions reduction legislation passed in Oregon for several years. It's been stymied, and then in 2019 and 2020, bills that looked as though they had a really good chance of passing were actually thwarted because the Republicans just got up and walked out and broke the quorum. And I'm going to get back to the governor's response to that in a few minutes. But one of the things that I think our legislators learned is that maybe rather than moving huge comprehensive bills that you probably appreciate will instantly generate a wealth of opponents in lots of different areas, that what we might best do is address the problem rather piecemeal, take it a small bite at a time, and therefore not raise the hackles of everybody and their dog. And this is what happened in the current legislature. The first bill I'm going to talk about was House Bill 2021, which flies under the title Clean Energy Act, and it really means Clean Electricity Act. This was proposed by our House Representative, Pam Marsh, who is a champion of climate and environmental action, and is also supported by Con Farm, who is a very new member of the legislature from the Portland area, who represents the social justice arena. And so this bill came from an environmentalist and a social justice proponent. And so they got at least that sort of bipartisan support off the bat. And so this is what HB 2021 does. It requires that Oregon's electricity shall be 100% generated by clean resources by 2040. The beauty of the legislature is that it can require all electricity sold in Oregon shall be manufactured, produced, generated, I should say, by clean power plants. Whereas Oregon's Department of Environmental Quality, acting alone, does not have the authority to regulate anything out of state. So this bill demands that any electricity retailed in Oregon by 2040 shall be generated by greenhouse gas free power plants. It also has $500 million as an incentive to promote energy resilience and small-scale clean energy projects like community solar projects. It provides funds for energy efficiency and rebuilding after the recent wildfires. One of the things that those of us who are concerned about climate and our forests have been very conscious of is that as we build back after the wildfires that ravaged Oregon, and you probably know particularly the case over here in Bear Creek Valley, that what we have to do is build back much better. And that means building back in a way that our homes and our construction is resilient to fire, not susceptible to fire. That's a very important and critical component. And that the reason that's important is because that, whatever you want to call it, 1 in 100-year fire, that's going to happen more and more often as climate change continues. Another element of the Clean Energy Act is that it bans new fossil fuel power plants. So there can be no new power plant constructed in Oregon that is based on fossil fuels, and that includes fossil gas, natural gas. And indeed, existent natural gas power plants cannot engage in massive remodeling to increase their capacity. So the Clean Energy Act is a really great proposal to target that element, that component, that sector in our economy. Opposing the Clean Energy Act was a certain representative, David Brock Smith from House District 1. Another bill that passed, this one was actually promoted by Governor Brown, House Bill 2062, the Appliance Energy Efficiency Act. And what that did was establish energy efficiency standards for a number of appliances, particularly for appliances that are used in the restaurant business. It was opposed by Representative David Brock Smith and Senator Dallas Hurd. House Bill 2475, the Energy Affordability Act, was a way of supporting low-income families who cannot afford energy bills. And if you want to take a wild-ass guess as to who might have been opposing that, I'll help you out. House Bill 2165, the Alternative Transportation Fuels Act, requires large electric companies to charge consumers for their supporting transportation electrification. One of the incredibly important things that we all can do to counter greenhouse gas emissions is support a transition to electric everything. There's an organization called Electrify Now in Oregon, and that's their motto. We have to electrify everything, our transportation and our homes. If you're using fossil gas at home, you should try as best you can to convert whatever appliance is using that fossil gas to an electric source. And the reason for that very simply is, even if our electricity is now generated from a coal-fired power plant in Utah or Idaho or whatever, what we know from our House Bill 2021 is pretty soon that's not going to be the case. It will be clean energy. So please electrify everything you can. Opposing this, Representative David Brock Smith and Senator Dallas Hurd. The Transportation Electrification Act asks state parks, or requires state parks and the Recreation Department to install public electric vehicle charging stations in parking spaces in those state parks. Opposing it, the Energy Affordability Act supports low-income families. Oh, it looks as though we already had that one. Oh, no, this is a different one. The Healthy Homes Act is a different one. 2842. That awarded $10 million in new funding for healthy homes and repair of homes. And that's going to be funded through the Oregon Health Authority, supporting low-income Oregonians with energy efficiency retrofits. And what you can see here is a component of the effort in the legislature to address exactly the problem that Bill Gorham raised earlier about making sure we address social justice as we are addressing climate issues. A bill that was actually proposed by our Senator, Jeff Golden, 762, is called the Omnibus Wildfire Response Bill. And this is a bill that really grew out of the Governor's Wildfire Council report, which I think it reported back in 2019. And the legislature had done nothing about it. In fact, they were trying to do something during 2020 when the Republicans just walked out. And so that thwarted a lot of action on other bills besides just climate bills. So what this is doing is funding additional firefighting capacity and forest thinning, not logging, thinning the dense undergrowth that's sort of clogging our forests as a result of years of fire suppression. From it funds community defense and home hardening. Home hardening means promoting construction that is resistant to fire. One of the real problems that we had in Bear Creek Valley with the Alameda fire last year was what it did is rip through the cities. It didn't even start as a wildfire. It started as a grass fire, and it just consumed human construction. And if you go back long enough, of course, several decades, people weren't even thinking about wildfires when they built. And so there was this incredible density of homes built of wood without any kind of resistance to fire, particularly having shingle roofs rather than metal roofs, for example. And so what we need to do when we build back from fire is promote the construction of homes, buildings that are resistant to fire. And this proposal offers money to support that. But what was not passed during 2021, a couple of things that weren't passed. One was there was no passage of a severance tax. There was a really serious effort to reimpose in Oregon a severance tax, which would be a tax on harvested trees. What has happened over the last 20 to 30 years is Oregon had a severance tax, but because of the pressure of the timber industry, that severance tax went way down to almost nothing. And the consequence of that is, and I don't know whether Curry County is a product of this problem, but the consequence of that is counties were losing money. And so the severance tax proposal that was introduced was designed to tax timber harvest and return the funds, much of the funds, to the counties so that the counties would be able to fund their basic services, education, fire, police, libraries, and so forth. Another bill that was introduced was a bill to reform the Oregon Forest Resources Institute. And if you are not familiar with that little creature, then you can certainly be excused because you probably have to be very much engaged in the whole forestry issue to know about them. But OFRI, as it's familiarly called, is an entity which actually serves the timber industry and is funded by taxpayer money. And so our taxes are going to subsidize the timber industry. And what it does is promote educational materials that promote logging as the solution to everything and resists anything that is remotely responsible for addressing climate change that might compromise logging. What the timber industry seems to totally fail to understand is if they don't get behind climate legislation, their forests are going to either A, burn up, or simply the species of which they're composed are simply not going to be able to survive in Oregon any longer. So that's pretty much it for the legislative session. So another little arch photograph from the parking lot at Arch Rock, just to help you cool off a bit. And then we'll get into the governor's executive order. And I'm going to gloss through a couple of points very quickly. I've already talked about what happened to House Bill 2020 and Senate Bill 1530. So in response to that, and in fact, Governor Brown was composing this, or at least her staff were composing this long before the Republicans walked out in 2020, simply because it was expected that they were going to do that. So what she signed into law was Executive Order 2004. It was March 2020 that she signed this into law. And what this does is put Oregon on a path to achieve at least 45% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions from the 1992 level by 2035, and at least 80% by 2050. It also promotes carbon sequestration in our natural and working lands. And it also applies a social justice lens to everything that the agencies do. And it asks the agencies to consider cost effectiveness. This executive order charged 16 state agencies to do whatever they can within their authority to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. And I will say, when I heard 16 agencies, I thought, well, that's probably all of them, isn't it? Well, it turns out Oregon has about 120 state agencies and commissions. And so this is a relatively small proportion of the total number. So it actually was 16 that were charged to use their authority. Okay, the program that was established as a consequence of that executive order has come to be known as the Oregon Climate Action Plan, OCAP. So within that, the Department of Environmental Quality was charged to develop a program which is calling the Climate Protection Program. And that has something called a Community Climate Investment Fund, which is its way of incorporating what are called offsets into the program, which I can talk about if somebody wants to get into. The Department of Forestry is developing something called the Climate Change and Carbon Plan. The Oregon Department of Agriculture is developing proposals for agricultural lands. The Oregon Global Warming Commission has a natural and working lands carbon plan, which promotes carbon sequestration. The Public Utilities Commission is promoting renewable energy sources in electrical generation. The Oregon Department of Transportation has a strategic transportation improvement plan, which is more climate sensitive than previous plans have been, but still doesn't go as far as it should. The Health Authority, Oregon Health Authority, actually developed an excellent report and is focusing on Oregon's mental and physical health, particularly amongst our youth. The Oregon Department of Energy has been developing, and I mentioned this as a bill, Clean Energy Standards for Appliances. The Oregon Department of Land Conservation and Development, which is one of the agencies about which I knew almost nothing until I started getting into this, they are incorporating climate considerations into zoning. And so they're taking steps in this direction. Unfortunately, what really is happening is the agencies are falling short on developing programs that meet the governor's charge in that executive order, which you will recall was at least 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And if I were to go into the areas where the agencies are falling down, that would be an all-night program. So I am not going to do that. But if somebody wants to ask me a question about one or two of them, I'll do the best I can. So what can we do? The first thing that we can do is talk to others. We at SOCAN, some of you may have seen it, a couple of months back had a program that was delivered by Jennifer Marlin from the Yale Program on Climate Change Communication, which is the preeminent entity in the United States, or one of the two, that engages in discussions of climate change communication. And one of the things that Jennifer pointed out is we don't talk about climate change anywhere near as much as we can. What the research tells us is if we want to engage with folks who are a little skeptical about the issue of climate change, the best messenger is a family member. And so to those of you who find yourselves at the Thanksgiving dinner table with Uncle Bob or whatever, who's a climate science denier, don't duck the issue. Talk about it. And talk to Uncle Bob, find out what Uncle Bob cares about. And if he cares about his kids and his grandkids, start talking to him about how climate change is going to compromise the future for his kids and grandkids. So talk to people. That's the first and most important thing for us to do. Another one is engage with agencies, and this is an Oregon thing in relation to the Oregon Climate Action Plan that I just mentioned. Engage with agencies who are developing their plans. And in particular, one of the agencies with which I've been particularly involved is the Department of Environmental Quality, which has just come out with its climate protection plan rules, which are unfortunately rather weak. And so what we are doing is communicating, engaging with DEQ, the Environmental Quality Commission, which is what will ultimately enact any proposal that comes out of DEQ, and the governor, to try and make sure that that program is as rigorous as we can make it. That DEQ climate protection program is now on a 60-day public comment period, which ends on October the 4th. And there are various elements in that bill that we would really like folks to comment on. So if you think you'd like to engage in submitting comments to the agencies, please contact me. I'm more than willing to provide you with a page full of talking points and targets to send comments to. Also, contact and support federal and state legislators who are champions of climate action. And that means those who are supporting action to address the problem at the state and federal level. One of the things that happens, and I think to all of us, is we have a tendency, and I mentioned to you that Pam Marsh and Jeff Golden are champions for climate action. One of the things we have a tendency to do is to say, oh, I don't need to write to Pam because I know she's going to be on board. Well, that's not a very good approach to take, because what we need to do is to make sure Pam understands that we have her back, that her action on climate is supported by her constituency, because you know full well she's getting communications from Avista, which is the local natural gas company, resisting everything she does. So she needs to hear from us. Same for Jeff Golden. And at the federal level, certainly we need to be communicating with Jeff Merkley and Ron Wyden, who are largely champions of climate action. Not always perfect, but generally champions. And so we need to be encouraging them by saying, we really appreciate your doing this and this and this. We wish you hadn't done that, but they need to hear from us. On the other side of the coin, contact and campaign against federal and state legislators who are obstacles. And again, oftentimes we live in Congressional District 2, so we have the pleasure of the only Republican member of the federal delegation out of Oregon. And so very often people will say, well, and they said this with Greg Walden, of course, before him. They said, what's the point in writing to him? He's not going to pay any attention to anything I say. But that's not the approach to take. What we need to do is contact those people so that they cannot say, well, nobody ever told me about, nobody ever asked me about that. We've got to chew on their butts and make sure they understand that what they're doing is not appreciated by many of their constituents. And of course, those of you who are living in House District 1 and Senate District 1 have two characters who really, really need to get a message. Okay, so closing out, just to prove that, again, we did make it to the top of Humbug Peak, 1,748 feet from sea level. There's the shot from the top. And here again is, now I think that's called the Mary Home, is it? That sunken tug in Gold Beach. Kathy always says to me, don't take a photograph of that, but I just can't resist. Okay, so I've wrapped up, Bill.
All right. Well, that is.
Stop sharing so we can all see one another.
There we go. Well, that was fantastic from my perspective, and we've had some good comments in the chat. What I'll do is read a couple questions and then see about having people ask questions themselves. But Bill,
Okay.
asked, how does the state's community solar program fit into the solution to get to 100% renewable? Does it make a difference?
Was it the community solar programs?
Yeah. How does the state's community solar program fit into the solutions to get to 100% renewable?
Well, fortunately, since House Bill 2021 requires that by 2040, all the electricity in Oregon is going to be clean, even if we don't have local community solar programs, by 2040, we're going to be there. But what we know, from back from the beginning is we need to be faster than that. We need to get to zero energy as soon as we can. And the advantage of things like community solar is they allow individuals who are renting or have homes that don't have the appropriate aspect for solar panels. Those programs allow individuals to engage with group efforts, cooperative efforts, so that they may not actually have panels on their roof that pump electricity into their house, but they have bought into panels that are installed somewhere else that pump electricity into the grid that is clean, and that is as effective as having panels on your house, because what you're doing is cleaning up the grid. So to the extent that you use electricity, if you have invested in a community solar program, what you're doing is replacing the maybe coal-fired electricity that you use with clean electricity, which is just as good as making your own electricity and using it in your own house in terms of the big picture. So I think it's valuable. So yes, we should get involved in that as much as we can.
That's the same sort of response that we got from Jake Knudsen from Coos Curry Electric. Same sort of thing. There is value, even if you're a renter, to plug into something like that, if you can do it. Had one,
and then of course you can, wherever you live, assuming you're in the same area, but wherever you live, you can still be participating in that process wherever you're renting, and still counter whatever electricity you use from the solar panels that you own in the co-op.
Right. A practical question, Linda Bozak asked if you had any problem with sharing tonight's recording on Facebook, Instagram, and other social media.
None at all.
Okay. I did mention.
I don't think I said any rude words, did I, Bill? Except BS.
I wanted to, let's see, one other, Ed, I believe you had a question, and probably better for you to ask it yourself if you're willing to. I had muted a number of people. So if you're inclined to do that, if not, I can go ahead and ask the question. So, well, let me just read it here. From Debworth and Ed Patterson. I'm Debbie Downer, and I feel that we don't have the political will to do anything near what is needed to happen since we get distracted by wars and virus. How can we plan for a different planet?
Yeah.
30 seconds, please.
Okay. I don't have a magic bullet. What I have is my philosophy, and I'll share that with you. And I'm sorry if some of you have heard this before and want to just turn off. But in 1995, I was diagnosed with acute myeloid leukemia. The oncologist said, if we don't treat you, you'll be dead in 2 months. You better get your affairs in order. But he said, okay, on the other hand, if we can get you through 4 rounds of chemotherapy, total body irradiation, and a bone marrow transplant, what we find is your chance of being alive in 2 years goes from 20% up to 50% over that range. Of course, I'm assuming we get you through that first round and into remission. And so, you know what I did. I didn't say, oh, no, it's too late. It's too late. I took the medical advice. And I use this story often when I'm doing presentations on climate change and our responses, because I think it's a perfectly good illustration. We do not know if we have crossed the tipping point. We don't know. Just in the same way, at that point, I didn't know if I was doomed. I knew that I trusted the oncologist. So he said, you got a 20% chance now, it'll go up to 50. No, who likes that, you've got a 50% chance of being alive in 2 years, but next to dead in 2 months, it sounds pretty good. But all we can do is say, I want to be in that 20%. I'm going to do everything I can to be in that 20%. There's no guarantee, whatever I do, that I will be in that 20, 30, 40, 50%. But I am absolutely confident that if I do nothing, the outcome is going to be dead in 2 months. So that to me is where we are with global warming, climate change. We don't know that we're going to solve the problem, but we do know if we don't do the best we can, we are up the proverbial creek without a paddle.
I completely agree. Because we've got only 9 minutes left, Colleen had asked a question, which unfortunately I don't think we can get to. It's pretty detailed, but can you share specifically what David Brock Smith did not agree with on the individual bills that he voted against?
I cannot. All I know is the way he voted.
Yeah. And so that's where it's consistent with what you had said.
Let me
with your.
Can I tell you a secret?
A recording. Yeah.
Well, it's not that much of a secret, but David Brock Smith actually carried the energy appliance bill to the House floor from the committee. And one normally expects the person who's carrying the bill to be in favor of it. But he carried it and voted against it.
Well, I think that what the question and your answer, it shows why it is important for us to talk with our representatives and find out, well, what was it that wasn't appropriate, or what did he object to? It's far, far better than just a blanket characterization of saying, well, they're always against everything. So educating, having a chance to educate your representatives is important. I also like your reminder to talk to our senators and representatives when they're doing a good job, because to say, yeah, you're doing a good job, it's nice. There is, as somebody had mentioned, Peter DeFazio, our rep here, is having a phone-in public, a town hall meeting tomorrow, and it is worthwhile to check in with him and thank him for what he's doing. Now,
I see Ed has a question.
okay.
Yes, I'd like to take the next 20 minutes to list all of the damage climate change has caused already, but I won't. You're well familiar, better than I. So we've got tremendous impacts of climate change, and we're going to see a lot more. How do we prepare? How do we prepare for this? The migration is going to be tremendous. The loss of food supplies is going to be tremendous. We've got to start taking action to get ready for these things. And I don't see anything happening in that area, and I don't know how to make it happen.
That's a difficult question. Several years ago, there was a very common refrain that I heard from legislators. We shouldn't be wasting money on trying to push back against climate change. We should be just adapting. And we should be spending our money on adaptation so that we are prepared for the climate change that's coming. And my response to that is, that's very short-sighted, because if we don't combat climate change, there is absolutely no adaptation that we can do that will allow us to survive the kind of climate change that will befall us. So what we have to do is both. We have to both prepare for the climate change that's coming and fight against those forces that are making it worse. Now, I totally agree with you, Ed, that, and I use this argument again and again with people who like that George Will editorial, which ended up with him saying, well, you know, the gross domestic product is going to fall such and such if we really do all these things. And my response to that is not necessarily, because those states that have actually done things to address climate change are doing economically better than surrounding states who've done nothing. But the other thing I would say to people is, even if you are right, what are you going to eat when our agriculture, forestry, and fisheries are totally devastated?
Right.
Because the problem is to protect our food source, we absolutely have to address climate change.
Yes.
To protect our forests, and this is the thing that bugs me about timber unity in that whole arena. If we don't control climate change, and I have said this to people who ask, well, so what do you think our forests are going to be by the end of the century? And my answer, this is my sense of humor, tee, Joshua trees.
Marijuana.
But, you know, we've got to do everything we can to prepare for the unfortunate future climatic conditions. But if we don't fight it, if we don't combat the emissions, we're absolutely not going to have a future. And,
I-
you know, people say, you're an alarmist, you're an alarmist. And I say, if you understood the consequence of the trajectory we are on, you would be an alarmist.
I totally agree, Alan, as you know, but we now have a water shortage in Arizona and Colorado and Southern California, and that's going to affect a lot of foodstuffs. Right now, the farms are being denied their water right now, and this is only going to get worse. You know, if we reduced the GHGs immediately, we still have 20 years to battle climate change, and it is going to do a lot of destruction. Millions are migrating right now, and of course, this is affecting the poorest of the poor. We just don't seem to have a plan for accepting all of these degradations that are going to take place to our society. Okay, that's enough.
And work with people we can work with and do something.
Okay, can I just offer, and you know, I understand the total depression that you're voicing. But one of the things that sort of helps me, and I won't say it's really helps me a great deal, but leaves me at least doing something in this, I cannot control everything. However, I can do the best I can, and I can control my own behavior. So I can do the best I can to educate other people. And if they don't pay attention, after I've slapped them across the face a couple of times, then there's nothing more I can do. I mean, and it's unfortunate. And it may be that humanity is going down the toilet. But again, our only chance is to do the best we can do. And work with those people out there who agree with you and want to do the best that they can do as well. Because they're a wonderful bunch of people. I mean, they keep me going, frankly.
So on that note, we've got less than a
Bill, can
minute
I say a
left.
question? Can I ask a question?
Sure, Susan, one last one.
All right, I'll make one last point. And this is Alan. Is there anyone really talking about sustainability rather than gross national product and continuing to just keep growing population and growing the economy? It seems to me the key to this is that we address how can we sustain what we have rather than continuing to consume it. That's my concern. There's no conversation.
Absolutely. Yeah. One of my little pithy phrases is, or paragraphs maybe, is we live on a finite planet with finite resources and a finite capacity to process our waste. Until we understand that, we are doomed.
Right.
We have to live within our resources and the planet's capacity, and that's the sustainability. There are a number of folks who are focused on economics for a steady state world. I don't know that any of them are in our government, either the state or federal level, but there are folks working in that area. There's an institute at Southern Oregon University called the Post-Growth Institute. Donnie McClurkin is the director, and they are very aware of this. So there are people who are active in this area. Do they have as much influence politically as they should? No. I mean, point to me a politician who's going to get elected by saying, hey, folks, we live on a finite planet, blah, 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 blah.
Thank you, Alan. Thank you so much. It was really well presented to us. Appreciate it.
And I definitely want to echo that sentiment, Susan. Thank you. And there are a number of people, the comments in the comments saying the same thing. So Alan, as usual, again, given a fantastic presentation.
Save the chat.
Could you save the chat, Bill?
Yes, definitely save the chat.
Thank you.
And a reminder that for some people that didn't, as I put it in the chat, if you didn't get the invitation directly from me, so you were on our email list, send me an email, and that way I can make sure that you get the link or the instructions on how to see the presentation. It will be on SOCAN's website, and I can send you a direct way of getting into it. It's pretty easy, but it's worth doing. So,
And if anybody has any questions, please shoot me an email. It's easy to find me, alan@socan.eco.
and my email is just bill@socan.eco. So
We must be twins.
by a separate mother, that's what I understand, yes. All right, thank you, everybody. We had about 20 people that joined us, which I think is almost a record for, it is a record for our Zoom presentations. So clearly you are quite a draw, Alan. So, all right.
It's called animal magnetism.
There you go. Perfect. All right. Well, I'm
Thank
going to
you.
call it a night, and I thank everybody for joining us.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it.
Yep. And I'll stop the recording and